What happens when Hollywood's biggest star sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to find himself facing off against a host who seems determined to make him squirm? The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife as Brad Pitt settled into the guest chair, flashing that trademark smile that has charmed audiences for decades. But tonight, something felt different. The usual pre-show banter between host and guest was noticeably absent, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that even the studio audience seemed to pick up on. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think really went down that night. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one because what happens next will leave your jaw on the floor. Stephen Colbert walked onto his set with an unusual swagger, his smile seeming more predatory than welcoming. The Late Show had been struggling in the ratings lately, and whispers around the network suggested that drastic measures were being considered. "Ladies and gentlemen, Brad Pitt," Colbert announced with an exaggerated flourish, his voice carrying an edge that regular viewers might have mistaken for excitement. But those paying close attention could hear something else entirely, a hint of malice that would soon become impossible to ignore. Brad walked out, waving to the cheering crowd, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. He'd done hundreds of these interviews over his career, appearing on every major talk show multiple times. This should have been just another stop on the promotional circuit for his latest film. A routine chat about his craft, maybe a funny anecdote or two, and then on to the next appearance. Instead, it would become one of the most controversial moments in late-night television history. "Brad, great to have you back," Colbert said as they shook hands, his grip lasting just a beat too long, his eyes never leaving Pitt's face, as if studying his reaction to something. The audience cheered, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in the room that even they seemed to sense. "Always good to be here, Stephen," Brad replied, settling into his chair with the easy confidence of someone who had mastered the art of the talk show appearance. He adjusted his jacket, crossed his legs, and prepared for what he assumed would be the usual opening pleasantries about his flight, the weather, or perhaps a light-hearted question about his latest project. Instead, Colbert leaned back in his chair and delivered the first blow without warning. "So, Brad, let's talk about your reputation for being difficult on set. There have been some pretty serious allegations floating around Hollywood about your behavior toward crew members. Care to address those?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The studio audience, who had been chattering excitedly just moments before, fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to zoom in tighter, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. Brad's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning. Though anyone watching closely could see it, no longer reached his eyes. "I'm sorry, what allegations exactly are you referring to?" Brad asked, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious ambush. His media training was kicking in, but there was a flicker of confusion and growing irritation behind his polished exterior. This wasn't how these interviews typically went, and certainly not how his publicist had briefed him. This appearance would precede. Colbert pulled out a tablet and made a show of scrolling through it, as if he had a list of grievances prepared. "Well, there are reports from anonymous crew members on your last 3 films, claiming you were verbally abusive, demanding impossible working conditions, and generally making life miserable for everyone around you. One source described working with you as walking on eggshells around a ticking time bomb." The camera caught Brad's jaw tightening slightly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair just a little more firmly. The audience began to murmur uncomfortably, sensing that this had moved far beyond typical celebrity banter into something much more serious and potentially damaging. "Stephen, I think there might be some confusion here," Brad said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "I've worked with thousands of crew members over my career. If there are specific incidents you're referring to, of a prosecutor who thinks he's found his smoking gun, the details get much more interesting. According to these sources, you once threw a chair across a trailer because your coffee wasn't the right temperature. Another incident involved you screaming at a sound technician for 30 minutes because you could hear traffic noise during an outdoor scene on a public street in downtown Los Angeles. The allegations were so absurd that they might have been laughable under different circumstances, but Colbert was delivering them with such conviction that they took on an air of credibility that was deeply unsettling. Brad looked genuinely stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Those incidents never happened, Brad said firmly, his media-trained composure beginning to crack. I don't know where you're getting this information, but none of that is true. I've never thrown furniture in anger, and I certainly wouldn't berate crew members for doing their jobs. The host seemed to anticipate this denial and had his follow-up ready immediately. But isn't it true that you've had anger management issues? In the past, that you've struggled with controlling your temper, especially during stressful film productions. This was the moment when everyone in the studio realized that this had gone from an uncomfortable interview to something approaching character assassination. Brad's publicist, sitting in the green room, was frantically trying to get the attention of the show's producers, but the cameras kept rolling and Colbert kept pushing. "Stephen, what exactly are you trying to accomplish here?" Brad asked, his voice now carrying a dangerous quiet that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning sign. The folksy charm that had made him America's sweetheart was evaporating, replaced by something much more raw and human. "You invited me on your show to discuss my work, not to ambush me with fabricated stories about my character." Colbert's response was to double down with even more aggression. "Fabricated. That's interesting that you'd use that word, because isn't fabrication something you're quite familiar with? Your entire public persona is basically a fabrication, isn't it? The down-to-earth guy from Oklahoma, who just happens to be one of the most calculating and manipulative people in Hollywood." The audience was no longer just uncomfortable. They were genuinely shocked. Several people could be heard gasping, and the energy in the room had shifted from excited anticipation to something approaching dread. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was becoming a public execution. Brad leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Colbert's face. "You know what, Stephen? I think I'm starting to understand what this is really about. Your ratings have been tanking for months, haven't they? Your network is breathing down your neck, threatening to cancel your show, and you figured that creating some controversy at my expense might buy you a few more weeks of relevance." For the first time since the interview began, Colbert looked genuinely rattled. His practiced smile wavered, and there was a flash of something almost like panic in his eyes. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he chose to escalate further. "Ratings are just fine. Thank you very much," Colbert snapped, his carefully cultivated television persona finally cracking to reveal something much uglier underneath. "But since you brought up relevance, let's talk about yours. When was the last time you were in a movie that anyone actually cared about? When was the last time you gave a performance that wasn't just Brad Pitt playing Brad Pitt?" The personal nature of the attack was stunning, even by the standards of what had already transpired. Members of the studio audience were beginning to look around nervously, as if wondering whether they should leave or call security. The show's production staff, visible in the background, seemed frozen in place, unsure of how to handle a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. "You want to talk about my work?" Brad said, standing up from his chair with a fluid motion that somehow managed to be both graceful and threatening. "Let's talk about your work. Let's talk about how you've built your entire career on attacking people who can't fight back, on punching down at anyone who makes an easy target. You think hiding behind your desk and your writers makes you clever, but really, you're just a bully with a platform." Colbert shot to his feet as well, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Don't you dare lecture me about my career. I've been doing this for 20 years, building something meaningful, while you've been coasting on your looks and your charm, never actually having to work for anything in your life. Never had to work." Brad's voice rose for the first time, genuine indignation breaking through his attempts at maintaining composure. "I've been acting professionally for over 30 years. I've produced dozens of films, launched careers, supported causes that matter. What have you done besides sit behind a desk and tear down people who are actually creating something?" The host's response revealed just how desperate he had become. "Created something? You mean like created a public relations disaster for everyone who works with you? Created a toxic work environment that people have to suffer through just to be in a Brad Pitt movie? Created a legacy of narcissism and entitlement that's become legendary even by Hollywood standards?" By this point, several members of the audience had actually gotten up and left, unwilling to witness any more of what was unfolding. The remaining crowd sat in stunned silence, many holding their phones up to record what was clearly going to become a viral moment for all the wrong reasons. Brad took a step closer to Colbert's desk, his voice dropping to a level that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. You know what's really pathetic about this whole performance? You're so desperate to save your failing show that you're willing to destroy your own credibility to do it. How does it feel to know that, after tonight, nobody in this industry will ever trust you again? How does it feel to know that you've just ended your own career to try to damage mine? Colbert's hands were visibly shaking now, whether from anger or fear was impossible to tell. My career will be just fine. Unlike some people, I don't need to rely on my appearance to stay relevant. I have actual talent, actual intelligence, actual substance. Substance. Brad laughed, but there was no humor in it. You call this substance. Ambushing a guest with lies and personal attacks. If this is your idea of intelligent discourse, then maybe your ratings problems are worse than I thought. Maybe the audience is finally figuring out that there's nothing behind all that manufactured outrage except a bitter, jealous man who can't handle the fact that some people are more successful than he is. The accusation of jealousy hit its mark. Colbert's face went through a series of expressions, from shock to rage to something that looked almost like shame. But instead of de-escalating, he made the fatal decision to go even further. Jealous? Of what, exactly? Of your string of failed relationships? Of your reputation as someone who can't maintain a personal connection to save his life? Of the way your own children can barely stand to be in the same room with you? The mention of his children crossed a line that even Brad's considerable self-control couldn't tolerate. His entire body went rigid, his hands clenched into fists, and for a moment everyone in the studio thought they might witness something truly explosive. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic career, Brad said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible throughout the entire studio. You can attack me all you want, but you bring my children into this, and we're going to have a very different kind of conversation. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath as Brad Pitt stood there, every muscle in his body coiled with barely contained fury. Colbert, perhaps finally realizing he had pushed too far, took a small step backward, but it was too late to retreat from the precipice he had created. I think we should take a commercial break. One of the producers finally called out from off-camera, but neither man paid any attention. They were locked in a stare-down that felt like it could last forever or explode into violence at any second. You know what the real tragedy is here, Stephen? Brad continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his footing in this new, more dangerous territory. You had a platform that millions of people trusted. You had the opportunity to actually contribute something meaningful to the conversation, to use your position to elevate important issues and bring people together. Instead, you chose to become exactly the kind of divisive, destructive force that's poisoning our entire culture. Colbert's response was to grab a stack of papers from his desk and wave them dramatically. Don't you dare try to take the moral high ground with me. I have sources. I have documentation. I have proof of every single thing I've said tonight. You can't intimidate me into backing down just because you don't like hearing the truth about yourself. Sources. Brad laughed, but it was a sound entirely devoid of humor. You mean the same sources that told you I threw a chair over coffee temperature? The same sources that claim I screamed at a sound technician for doing his job? Let me guess, these sources all happen to be anonymous, and they all happen to tell you exactly what you wanted to hear to justify this character assassination. The host's grip on the papers tightened, his knuckles going white. These are credible. Reports from industry professionals who have worked with you directly. They're afraid to go on the record because of exactly this kind of intimidation and retaliation that you're known for. Brad took another step forward, now close enough to Colbert's desk that he could have reached across it. According to who? According to these mysterious sources who seem to exist only in your imagination. I think you got desperate, you got sloppy, and you decided to bet your entire career on a bunch of rumors and gossip that you couldn't be bothered to verify. By now, the studio audience had been reduced to perhaps a dozen people, most of whom were probably too shocked to move. The remaining crowd watched in fascination and horror as two public figures destroyed each other in real time. Live on national television, Colbert seemed to realize that his supposed evidence wasn't going to save him, so he pivoted to an even more personal attack. You want to talk about verification? Let's talk about how you've managed to keep your real personality hidden from the public for so long. Let's talk about the Brad Pitt that your colleagues actually know. The one who's nothing like the charming guy you play in interviews. The Brad Pitt my colleagues know. Brad's voice rose again, but this time it was with genuine incredulity. Rather than anger, you mean the Brad Pitt who's worked with the same directors multiple times because they actually enjoy collaborating with me. The Brad Pitt who's maintained friendships in this industry for decades. The Brad Pitt who's never had to resort to ambushing guests on television because his own work wasn't interesting enough to sustain a career. The comparison to Colbert's own career was devastating, and everyone in the room could see it hit home. The host's face went through a rapid series of expressions, settling on something that looked like desperate fury. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? You think because you're famous and successful and good-looking that you can just waltz through life without any consequences, without anyone ever calling you out on your behavior? Calling me out on what behavior? Brad demanded. You still haven't given me a single specific example of anything I've actually done wrong. All you've done is make vague accusations based on anonymous sources and then attack me personally when I asked for details. Is this really the kind of journalism you're proud of? The word journalism seemed to sting Colbert more than any of the previous attacks. His entire career had been built on the premise that he was more than just an entertainer, that he was actually contributing something meaningful to public discourse. Being dismissed as a failed journalist clearly cut deep. Don't you dare question my integrity, Colbert shot back, his voice cracking slightly. I've built my reputation on holding powerful people accountable, on asking the questions that other people are afraid to ask. Accountable for what? Brad's patience was finally completely exhausted. You've spent the last 20 minutes making accusations that you can't support, attacking my character based on nothing but gossip, and now you're trying to claim some kind of moral authority. You're not holding anyone accountable. You're just destroying people for your own entertainment. It was at this moment that something seemed to break inside Colbert. Whether it was the realization that he had irreparably damaged his own reputation, or simply the stress of maintaining his aggressive posture for so long, his whole demeanor suddenly shifted. "Get out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just get out of my studio." Brad stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to process what he was hearing. "Excuse me," I said. "Get out," Colbert shouted, his voice breaking entirely. "This is my show, this is my studio, and I want you out of here right now." The demand was so unprofessional, so completely outside the bounds of normal television behavior, that even Brad seemed stunned. He looked around the studio as if checking to see whether this was actually happening, whether a major television host was actually throwing him off a live broadcast. "You know what, Stephen?" Brad said finally, his voice calm again for the first time since the interview began. "You're absolutely right. This is your show, and you're welcome to it. But when this airs, when people see what you've done here tonight, they're going to remember exactly what kind of person you really are. And that's going to be your legacy, not mine." With that, Brad Pitt walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from the damage he had inflicted on himself. The cameras continued rolling as Colbert stood alone behind his desk. The weight of what he had done finally beginning to sink in. The remaining audience members sat in stunned silence, many of them still recording on their phones, capturing the moment when a television host's desperation and jealousy finally destroyed everything he had worked to build. What do you think really motivated Colbert's behavior that night? Was it really about ratings? Or was there something deeper driving his need to tear down one of Hollywood's biggest stars? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more incredible stories from behind the scenes of Hollywood's biggest moments.